folks. Let's talk a little bit about feedback and revision, which are two elements of the writing process that tend to go hand in hand. So feedback is often integral to revision and can include any commentary that you receive on a piece of writing. Within the classroom, that commentary might come from peers and professors. Beyond the classroom, you might get commentary from friends and family or even a writing group. But regardless of where your feedback comes from, it can offer a variety of things that will help you make revisions as you move into that part of your writing process. So one of the things feedback offers is the perspective of a reader. It lets you know what a reader is getting out of the story that you wrote and how they're interpreting it. And based on how you feel about those interpretations, you can maybe make some decisions about whether or not you want to adjust any of the content. Feedback often includes a wide variety of ideas, including suggestions for how to cut things that could be cut, things that could be added, things that could be presented in a different way. And oftentimes these suggestions or comments are very targeted, which makes them easy to apply. And then finally, feedback can give you some insight into what's working well, too. Good reviewers will often include some kudos to identify the strongest parts of the story, which is not only great for the writer's ego, but it also lets the writer know which parts of the story are in good shape and probably don't need very much work. So all of this information can be useful as you're starting to think about what you might want to do during revision. So sometimes people feel uneasy about both receiving feedback and providing feedback. Sometimes people feel very protective of their writing, or they're not completely confident in their writing, and that makes them apprehensive about sharing it with someone else and asking them for comments. In providing feedback, sometimes people feel a little apprehensive about being critical of someone else's work. All of those concerns are valid and common. And so there are a few things to keep in mind that may be helpful and may make the process a little bit more comfortable. One thing to consider is that as an author, you are not obligated to make every change that someone suggests. Ultimately, you are in the driver's seat. I think it's a good idea to seriously consider every change that someone suggests, but you may discover that there are changes that don't align with your vision for a story that you're writing. And in that case, it is completely appropriate to put those comments aside and say, well, that doesn't really work for me. The other thing to consider is that revision doesn't just come from outside sources. It doesn't just come from feedback. It also comes from the ways that your own ideas have evolved. So consider, as you're maybe coming up with a sort of revision plan in your head, consider not just what other people have said, but also your own ideas as you revisit the story that you wrote and maybe have some new insights. The final thing to consider is that the primary goal of revision is growth. Ultimately, the people who are providing feedback are trying to do so to assist you. So that can sometimes be helpful to keep in mind as well. It's also worthwhile to think of growth in the sense that it's about change and expansion as opposed to taking something from bad to good. If someone's giving you some suggestions about how to improve your story, that doesn't mean that they don't like your story or that your story is not high quality. It just means that they're trying to help you figure out what you can do to take the next step in developing your story. So sometimes if we think about revision in terms of growth as opposed to fixing things, that can make processing feedback feel a little more comfortable and a little less threatening. So all of these elements, I think, are just as important to consider when you're giving feedback as they are to consider when you're receiving feedback. When you're giving feedback, I think this whole idea of promoting growth is really important. I know that sometimes people are concerned about how to provide critical feedback, and I always recommend that people think of it as suggesting something. Phrasing can make a big difference. You can phrase a suggestion in a really friendly and non-combative way. You could say things like, hey, have you thought of adding X, Y, or Z? Or you could maybe mention that you had a question about something that happened in a certain scene. You don't necessarily have to say, hey, this isn't working, or this isn't doing what you want it to do. There are ways that you can frame constructive criticism in a friendly and respectful way. Another thing to consider is that ultimately, only providing positive feedback might be good for the author's ego, but it's not going to help them improve their writing if that's all they're getting. I know that getting a comment that says, hey, it was great, I loved it, is really great to hear, but it doesn't really leave you with much to do if you're starting to revise your story. So consider the kind of feedback that would be useful to you to receive as a writer. And really think about it in terms of like usefulness, utility, because I think that that's the kind of feedback you should be striving to give as well. So now that we've talked a little bit about giving and receiving feedback, let's talk a little bit about how to apply that feedback to the revision process. So sometimes you might have feedback that there's just all kinds of comments coming from a variety of sources, and it can feel overwhelming. It's possible that you already have a great system in place for dealing with writing feedback. And if so, this 4-point plan that I laid out may not be quite on your wavelength. You may already have a plan in place, but if you're someone that tends to feel a little bit overwhelmed when you're looking over all the notes that people gave you and trying to figure out where to go from here, this is something that might be worth trying. So one of the things that I always recommend, if possible, is to give yourself some time after you read the feedback before you do anything else. Ideally, if you could give yourself a day and then go back to it, that would be great. But I know that sometimes people are in a time crunch. So even if you can just give yourself an hour or two, going back to it will help you be more objective. I feel like sometimes the first time we read through feedback, there's more potential for a more sort of emotional response or a more intense response, whereas when we come back to it after that first read through, we can sometimes be more objective and productive in our responses. So from there, once you've, processed and reviewed the feedback, maybe just make notes on or circle any of the suggestions or comments that align with the vision for your story. And that will help you figure out, hey, here's what I want to change or adjust, and here's maybe what I'm just going to ignore. From there, I would recommend breaking the revision process down into manageable pieces. And manageable pieces can mean a lot of different things. It might mean taking a break every hour while you're revising, or it might mean just doing a page or two every day and spreading out the revision throughout the week. Whatever manageable means to you, I think it's worth considering that. You don't have to sit down and revise the whole paper in one session. And in fact, it's probably not going to be productive to do so because your brain is probably going to get kind of burned out. So that's something to consider as well. And then, of course, once you've figured out how you're breaking down the revision process, then comes the task of actually making the changes. Sometimes a revision schedule might help, even if it's only in your head. This is a sample 1 week revision schedule. So let's say you're writing a 10 to 15 page short story or memoir, and you have a week to revise it. This is one approach that you could potentially take. Monday, maybe you just read the feedback and then you put it away for a day. And then on Tuesday, you review the feedback and make some sort of revision plan based on the feedback and the new ideas that you've had. And then Wednesday and Thursday are all revision, where you're actually making the changes that you identified. And then Friday is proofreading, where you're just looking for things like spelling and grammar and typos and things like that. So this would be one approach to breaking down the revision process into smaller chunks. So ultimately, I hope that this gives you some tools for navigating these elements of the writing process. I know there are elements that we're all probably familiar with to some extent, but sometimes there are things about them that can be tricky. So I hope this is helpful. And as always, you can always come to me with concerns as you're working through these things.